Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. Hope y'all are doing well today. I'm so glad to have you here. Looking forward to getting into some fun exercises, answering questions, and just talking about Spanish. So, I'm very, very excited for you to join me. I've got a few different ideas in mind for some exercises that we can get into today. But first off, I just want to see if anybody's got any questions as far as anything specific that they've been having trouble with recently. There's a lot of different things that go into learning a language that can be very, very difficult to grasp. And whether it's pronunciation, conjugation, that's a really big one. The just vocabulary, learning vocabulary, getting used to listening to speakers. It's a lot learning a language, and I'm here to help in whatever way that I can. I want to answer as many questions as I can today, but I also do want to see if we can get into some some different exercises, just kind of help you to improve your skills as far as making sentences, getting used to conversations with native speakers. That's something that's really the biggest part of learning a language, is just getting used to forming sentences in conversations, replying to people, and formulating thoughts on the fly. It can be pretty tricky. So I'm here for you guys, and I think the first thing that I do want to go ahead and do today is just kind of open the floor up for some exercises that we're gonna do. What I'm thinking I'd like to do today is I'm gonna go ahead and transition here real quick. And let me know if the audio's sounds okay. I've got the music turned down a bit. It should be okay right now, I think. But if there's any issues, if the music's too loud, or if my voice isn't loud enough, or if there's any issues, definitely let me know. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna transition here. So what I'm thinking we could do that would be fun today is to do some exercises for learning Spanish. So I want to just put some sentences out, and we can work through the solutions together on how we get to our answers. So the first prompt that I'm going to do is, if he had the money, he'd come to the party. I'm going to make this centered, so it's a little bit easier to see. So if he had the money, he'd come to the party. So does anybody have any ideas on how we're going to start by translating this? Got some words in here that I think all of us pretty much know, so we can start with those. Okay, sounds good here. Audio's good. Thank you, Brett. Appreciate that. So if he had the money, he'd come to the party. So this is an example of a conjugation pair, basically. So there's going to be two verb tenses that we use in this sentence that are basically going to pair up with each other in these sorts of constructions, which is an if-then statement. So if he had the money, he would come to the party, or then he would come to the party. The sentence is the same whether you put that then in or not. So this is an if-then statement. This is a hypothetical statement is what this is. So we need to make sure that we're using a conjugation that lends itself to hypothetical statements. So let's start with, if he had the money, he'd come to the party. Well, the word for if we know is sí. Now that's not sí with an accent mark. That would be the word for yes. But sí without the accent mark is going to be our word for if. So if he had the money. So he, in a sentence like this, we could include that word if we wanted to. It kind of just depends on the context of the situation. If it's already clear from context, we don't necessarily need to include that. So if he had the money, you would say if él. Si él. So those are our first two words. Si él, if he. And then this word right here, had. So how are we going to conjugate? So first off, what word are we going to use for to have? What's the word in Spanish that means to have? Does anybody know? Check the chat here, see if anybody knows what we've got for to have. What's the translation for to have? Does anybody know? Tener. Okay, very good. So we're going to use the verb. We're going to use the verb tener. Exactly. So when we use this verb in this conjugation, in this sort of scenario right here, if he had the money. So this is a hypothetical statement. So because it's a hypothetical statement, we need to use the subjunctive, okay? Subjunctive for hypotheticals. And because this is in the past tense, it's if he had the money, we're going to need to use the past tense subjunctive, which is the imperfect subjunctive. Make sure we can see that okay. Make myself a little bit smaller here. I'm gonna move myself up to this corner so I'm out of the way here so we can see a little bit better. So we need to use the imperfect subjunctive here, which is going to be the past tense subjunctive, right? So how do we form the past tense subjunctive? How do we form the imperfect subjunctive? So there's kind of a process that we need to go to if we're working with irregular verbs, which tener is an irregular verb. So we can't just conjugate straight into the imperfect subjunctive in this case. The first thing that we need to do is we're going to go into the preterite first, then adjust to form our imperfect subjunctive. So with tener, and I'm going to go ahead and use the board for this here. So I'm going to just make myself a little bit bigger. Oops. Daisies. Hold on one second. Okay. I'm going to use the board here for this. Okay. Now, the verb tener is pretty irregular, especially in the preterite. So tener, which is to have. In the preterite, and I'm just going to go ahead and write our subjects on the side here first. So we've got yo, we've got tú, and vos. We've got él, ella, usted. Okay. Hola, Alejandro. Bienvenido. Gracias por el comentario. All right, we've got él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, and ellos, ellas, ustedes. Okay. Okie dokie. Okay. So, what we need to do is we need to start first off with the preterite. So we're going to do the preterite tense conjugations for tener. Okay. So we've got yo, tuve. We've got tú and vos. Tuviste. Él, ella, usted. You guys can see the board okay? Looks like it. Okay. Tuvo. Nosotros. Tuvimos. Vosotros. Tuvisteis. And ellos, ellas, ustedes. Tuvieron. Okay? So we need to form the imperfect subjunctive from one of these conjugations here. So does anybody know which form of our preterite we need to use in order to form the imperfect subjunctive? What comes first to make the imperfect subjunctive from the preterite? Okay. So for the imperfect subjunctive, we're going to start with our preterite first in the third person plural form. So that's the form for ellos, ellas, and ustedes. Okay. So in this case, for tener, to have, the third person preterite, the third person plural preterite form is tuvieron. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up on here so we can see it better. Tuvieron. So once we have this form right here, this tuvieron, we need to make some adjustments to this so that we can get the imperfect subjunctive. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these last three letters right here, ron. In this case, it's going to be ron. And we're going to drop those letters. Okay, so we're going to say goodbye to ron. And then from there, we're going to add our conjugations based on which subject we're using. So for the imperfect subjunctive, let's see. The IMP, imperfect subjunctive. Okay, so for the imperfect subjunctive, they're all going to start using this PUVIE form. So let's start by writing those down first. PUVIE, IE, E, okay, so they're all going to start with that form because when we make the imperfect subjunctive, we always start with that third person plural preterite form, which was tuvieron. We drop the RON, and then we're going to add our endings. So in this case, we're conjugating for él, which is he. If si él, and we're going to conjugate it for él, ella, and usted. So in these cases, the conjugations for these guys here are going to match the conjugations for yo. And does anybody know what we need to do in order to get that? What we need to add for our ending for the imperfect subjunctive? Let's see. So there's actually two things that we can do here. There's two options for us. So the first option is to add either an RA, and the second option is to add an SE. So we could use tuviera or tuviese. Now, these are the exact same conjugation for él, ella, and usted. Yeah. And that's one thing that's really interesting about the imperfect subjunctive, and I mentioned this in my conjugation video, is it is the only verb tense in Spanish that has two equally recognized, equally correct conjugation forms that it can be used in. They're both correct here. Tuviera and tuviese are both fine to use. Now, this conjugation with the RA, you're going to see that a lot more often. That's definitely the much more common form here. But you can also use tuviese. It is totally fine to use that as well. And the conjugations are going to be the exact same down here. So we could say si él tuviera or tuviese. Okay, so we're partway through the sentence here. If he had, si él tuviera, tuviese. Those are both totally valid options here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and draw this on the board here. I'm going to fill this out really quick so that we have a good idea of what else we can use in these situations for the imperfect. Now, when we conjugate for nosotros here, we need to make sure that the E that comes just before the R or just before the S in our ending here, that E that's right there, that it needs to be stressed. This is the stressed syllable in the word. So it's tuviéramos. So if that E were not stressed, we took that off, this word would be pronounced as tuviéramos. And that's not correct. We need to make sure that we're stressing the correct syllable. So it's tuviéramos. And that's why we're going to use that accent on the E right there. Because this word ends in an S, and without that accent mark right there, it tells us that we would stress the second to last syllable. And we don't want to do that here. We want to stress the syllable that comes just before the E, just like we do in these other conjugations here. So we need to be careful of that. So we've got tuviéramos, we've got tuviera, tuvieras, tuviera, and then we've also got for vosotros, we've got tuvierais, okay? And then we've also got our optional second form, which is, oops. Tuvieses. And then for this one, it's going to be with an R-A-N or so we got tuvieran or tuviesen. So these are all two different forms for the imperfect subjunctive, but no matter what, in this situation here, with this hypothetical situation, it's a hypothetical situation, we need to use that imperfect subjunctive conjugation. So once we have our imperfect subjunctive right here, kudos to anyone wanting to learn a new language. Gracias, Avelina. Gracias. From the Dominican Republic. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, it is very complicated with all these different verb tenses that we've got. But as you do them more and more, they start to get really, really easy. Like this right here, how we have to use the preterite first and then drop that RON from the preterite. You get used to it after a while, and you just memorize the conjugations. You don't even have to think about it. This whole process that we're doing right here to get to the imperfect subjunctive, it's not something that you're going to be doing all the time. This is something that you're going to have to get used to at first when you're learning these words. But the more that we do it, the easier it's going to get. So preterite first in third person plural. Then adjustive form our imperfect subjunctive. Okay, so we've got the first three words in the sentence, and I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to drop tuviese here because this conjugation, this ESE, this version, it is a lot less common. You're going to find it in a lot more kind of like I guess, artsy context, in maybe more like fanciful or literary kind of context. And, maybe in certain countries you might hear it more in everyday spoken speech. But for the most part, this first option, tuviera, that's going to be a much more common option. Still struggle with the verb satisfacer, one of the verbs us native speakers always struggle with because it's very different for each pronoun. Yeah, that's an interesting one too. It's funny because and I mentioned this in my video on the future tense, that, and also the conditional, that satisfacer, which is to satisfy, is one of the only 13, there's 13 irregular verbs in the future and conditional tense, and then any other irregular verbs in those tenses, they're just derivatives of those verbs. So it includes those verbs, but then it just adds on that prefix in front of it. So like in this case, Mabelina had mentioned the verb mantener, which is to maintain, mantener. So in this case, for mantener, it's the exact same verb, but it adds this in front. So if this were if this sentence were, instead of if he had the money, if he maintained the money, then the conjugation here would be mantuviera. It's going to be the exact same conjugation, but just with that prefix added into the front right there. So that's the only thing that you're going to need to change. But in this case, it's tener, so it's tuviera. Si él tuviera. And then for the money, that's going to be the next part of our sentence here that we need to fill out. So what's the word for money in Spanish? Does anybody know the answer? People decide to use such verb and use a synonym instead. Yeah, that, when you're dealing with tricky verbs in Spanish and you're not quite able to remember the conjugation on the spot, you can kind of go around the word and just use the words that you do know and just kind of go in more of a roundabout way to explain what you're trying to describe to the listener, which it gets the point across. It does the job. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but it just takes more time and effort. But it's perfectly valid while we're learning. If you're trying to remember the word for something, or you just don't know the word for something, you can describe it in a more roundabout way. So, like, for example, when I had a customer, probably about a year ago now, and I was describing his motor on his machine. And some of you guys already know this, but I run a rental equipment store. But I was describing what was wrong with the motor on the machine that he had brought in for us to repair for him, and I was trying to tell him that the the spark plug was bad. The spark plug on the machine was bad. And I could not remember the word for spark plug, which is la bujía. La bujía is spark plug. It's just one of those random words that you don't really see all that often, so don't really commit it to memory. Now I know what that word is, but I didn't know the word for spark plug. So I said, la cosita que echa chispas. So I was basically saying the little thing that throws sparks. La cosita que echa chispas. So chispa is the word for spark, and echar, echa in this case is like to throw or to put out. It has a lot of different usages, but in this case it's la cosita que echa chispas. The little thing that throws out sparks is the spark plug. So I didn't know the word for spark plug, so in a more roundabout way I was describing to this customer what was wrong, what the mechanic had diagnosed on his machine was the issue, and I got the point across. He understood what I was talking about, and I was able to learn the word for spark plug at that point. And it's funny because as a non-native Spanish speaker living in the United States, a lot of the Spanish speakers around here, they incorporate a lot of English words into their speech. So I was asking him, I'm like, well, how would you say this word for spark plug? And he's just like, spark plug. They're like, we say spark plug. Well, this was just him in that example, but we say spark plug. We don't say bujia, even though that's the word for it. So that's something you're going to run into a lot if you're in the United States speaking with native Spanish speakers, that a lot of times they are going to use words for in English to describe whatever they're talking about. La troca, yeah. Yeah. The Mexican word for truck. Ah, que troca bonita. Yeah, that's a good one. Let's see. Super intense in the chat. Curious how you learned Spanish or what made you want to learn. Okay, yeah, we can take a quick detour and I'll discuss that, Marvelina, and that's totally fine. So, it's kind of a long story, and I describe it more in detail in the first video on my channel. But I did learn some Spanish in school when I was growing up in high school. But the fact is, I didn't really pay very much attention in my classes. You know, I did enough to get by. I passed my classes, but I didn't really commit myself to the language. And when I got out of school, I didn't use the language. I wasn't practicing. I wasn't speaking with native speakers. I wasn't really attempting to use the language in any real meaningful way. And my skills just kind of waned over time. And it got to the point where I forgot pretty much everything. And well, long story short, I was previously married and I had a family member through marriage who was Mexican. I had a number of family members, Mexican family members through marriage. And inevitably, one of those family members, he suffered an accident, a really bad accident that unfortunately cost him his life. And because of that, I realized at that point that I never really knew this man. He was a member of my family, and I never knew him. I never was able to connect with him, have conversations with him. He couldn't tell me stories from his life. I couldn't tell him any of my own stories. And I realized that it all just came from this fear of embarrassment that I had, this fear of making a mistake and sounding silly with native speakers. And I asked myself, well, is there really any way to improve our skills in the language without embarrassing ourselves? And I realized that ultimately there isn't. If you want to get good at Spanish, you have to get used to messing up. It's sorry if you guys are hoping that there's some, panacea that you just take this pill and suddenly you're just perfect Spanish speaker and you never have to worry about screwing up again. No, it does not work that way. But I realized because of this tragedy that I had faced, that I went through, that any embarrassment, any struggle in learning the language, any mistakes that I would make at any point, that it was always going to be worth it, And I deal with so many Spanish speakers in my life who they're trying to learn English, they're struggling to learn English, and a lot of my customers especially. And I figured, what the hell? If I can at least make an attempt to meet these people halfway, they're trying to improve their English, but if I can improve my Spanish and meet them halfway, then hey, that's going to be better than me just waiting for them to be a lot more fluent in English, just doing what I can to help bridge that language gap. And as it's sad that it took me going through an experience like that in order to change my mind about learning the language. But that's the reality of life sometimes. We don't really realize, what it's going to take or what's worth it to us before we have something taken away. But yeah, that's we say bujia here. Yep, exactly. But yeah, that's the reality of the situation. Is if you're wanting to learn a new language, you're an English speaker wanting to learn Spanish. If you're a Spanish speaker wanting to learn English, you have to get used to making mistakes. Part of the process. But the people that we talk with in our everyday conversations, the very fact alone that we're willing to make an effort to just try to communicate with them in their native language, even if we're screwing up, even if we sound horrible, the fact alone that we're willing to try, it means so much to them. It doesn't matter the mistakes that you make. And if they're going to correct you when you make a mistake, that just means that they recognize that you are able to improve your skills. You know, if someone corrects you, it's not because they're making fun of you. It's not because they think you're stupid. It's because they think you're smart. It's because they think you're smart enough to learn from your mistakes and to do better going forward. So we can't be afraid of making mistakes. We can't be afraid of being corrected. It's all part of the process. And it doesn't matter how fluent we're trying to get. It doesn't matter how much we're trying to grow our fluency. The fact is that any effort that we put in is going to help us. You know, no matter how much you do or how little you do, it's not like, oh, boom, one day you're fluent, you just wake up and you're fluent. It's a process that just takes time. So you got to be patient with yourself. Si él hubiese tenido dinero, él vendría a la fiesta. Okay, well, Alejandro's got helping us out here. Thank you, Alejandro. That's pretty much right there. So Alejandro does have it correct here. So I'm gonna pin this right here. So this is gonna be a perfect conjugation. So he's él hubiese tenido, which is it's the same thing, but it's using the verb haber as well. If everyone I meet from the US tells me they get basic Spanish and they never pay attention until now, and they wish they would have learned sooner. That's exactly right. Yeah, I agree 100%. You know, we don't, it's like they say, youth is wasted on the young. We don't realize how good we have it in school. We have somebody who literally it's their job to stand up there in front of a whiteboard and help us to grow our skills in language. And we don't take advantage of it when what else have we got that's, what do we got that's better to do than learn? But yeah, it does take certain experiences and maturing to learn that, hey, this is something that could be really valuable to me, and this is something that I really could do. But yeah, let's see. My sister's an English and Spanish teacher for the Major League Baseball, for the baseball players and for the coaches. I love how she's so passionate about teaching. Yep, absolutely, 100%. Speak English, French, Spanish, English, French, Catalan, want to learn Mandarin. Oh my goodness, Mavelina, you are killing it, girl. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, Mandarin, that's another language that you're going to hear all over the world, and just learning even a little bit of it, you're going to be able to connect with so many people. But yeah, let's go ahead. We'll get back to the exercise. So Alejandro does have a version that works here. So he's using hubiese tenido, which is totally fine to use in this sort of situation. But I'm just going to go ahead and kind of simplify it to use tuviera. So I'm not using the verb haber here. I'm just using tuviera. But the word for money is dinero. So it's el dinero. So we've got the first part of our sentence completed here. If he had the money, si él tuviera dinero. And we could move this to the end as well. Si tuviera dinero él. We could, si tuviera él el dinero, we could put it wherever we want. I'm trying to make it so that the structure of this sentence is as close as possible to the structure of its English counterpart, just for learning purposes. But yeah, that's where we're at. If he had the money, he'd come to the party. So the next verb that we're going to need to use is venir, to come, which is venir. Now, does anyone know which tense we're going to need to use for this? So let me do this. He would come to the party. He would come. So how are we going to say this? What tense are we going to use for this? Would equals, what do we use to say would? What verb tense do we use to say would? So we use the conditional. So the conditional is going to be how we're going to say would. So for the conditional, it is conjugated pretty much exactly the same first steps as the future tense. The conditional tense and the future tense, they're both going to be using pretty much the exact same structure for their conjugation. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to Make myself a little bit bigger here. Oops. Sorry, trying to select the right one here. Try to see that. There we go. Okay. Trying to make myself big enough on the board here. So for the conditional, can we see the board okay? Is that big enough here? Want to make sure. So the verb we're using is venir. Venir, which is to come. And we're going to be using it in the conditional. And again, the conditional is how we say what we would do. So that there's no verb for would, for what we would do in Spanish. We don't use a different verb for that. We just use a specific conjugation on our target verb. So in this case, it's going to be venir in the conditional. So the thing about the conditional, it sounds more the way we speak here in Chile. Okay, yeah, I gotcha. So with venir, it's one of the irregular verbs in the future and conditional tense. And like I mentioned earlier, there's only 13 of them aside from our derivatives. So venir is an example of one of the groups, the group of verbs, where it's going to replace this I right here, or the letter that's used in the ending. Tener is actually conjugated exactly the same way here, where it's going to replace the letter from the ending with a D. So we're going to take B-E-N, and then that I is going to get swapped out for a D. Okay, and then the way that I taught this in my video on the conditional, which I think is probably the best way to remember this while we're learning, is that the conditional conjugations are going to be the endings for the imperfect, for the indicative imperfect with our IR, our ER and IR verbs, and then it's going to be taking those endings and adding them onto the end of our infinitive. So the future and the conditional are the only two tenses where the verb ending gets added onto the infinitive. So in this case, it is irregular in that we're going to swap that I for a D. But then we're going to do everything else exactly the same. That's the only thing that makes it irregular, is that this I gets swapped out for a D. So does anybody remember how we do our imperfect ER and IR endings? How do we conjugate our imperfect IR and ER endings? What two letters are in every conjugation? So there's two letters that we use in every one of these conjugations for our imperfect ER and IR endings. And then those are going to be carried over to the conditional. So we use two letters. Does anybody know what they are? There's a minute here, see if we can figure it out. It's hard to catch up in English because I know the Spanish explanations. Okay, that's fair. Okay, so the two letters we're going to use are I and A. I'm going to go ahead and put this right here. For the conditional, use I. And then the I is going to have an accent mark on it. It's always going to have an accent mark on that right there. So I-A. So for the conditional, we're going to use I-A with an accent on the I. So in this case, it's going to be yo vendría, tú, vos, vendrías, él, ella, usted, vendría, nosotros, vendríamos, vosotros, vendríais, ellos, ellas, ustedes, vendrían. Hope we can see that okay. Seem big enough? I feel like that's big enough. Yeah, okay. Switch it to here. Okay. So, in this case here, we're going to use vendría because it's él, ella, and usted. So it's this conjugation right here. So, let's see. Go ahead and switch back. So, si él tuviera el dinero, vendría. Okay. So this word right here. So this word right here, vendría, it's going to take the place of these three words in English. He would come. Vendría. Okay? So now the only thing that we need to put in here is to the party. So what's the word for to? When we want to go to something, what word do we use? I'll give you a hint. It's just one letter. So what word do we use to say we are going to a place? So let's say, let's go to the beach. Aha, there we go. Vamos a la playa. There we go, exactly. Ah. So we're going to put a. So he would come to. Vendría a. And then the word for party, the party. And that is, I think everybody knows this one. La fiesta. Okay. So si él tuviera, if he had el dinero, the money, vendría, and vendría is he would come, okay, a la fiesta, to the party. Si él tuviera el dinero, vendría a la fiesta. If he had the money, he would come to the party. So the point of this right here, why I really wanted to use this combination here, is this combination here with tuviera and vendría, this imperfect subjunctive, and I'll go ahead and bold that right there, imperfect subjunctive and conditional. These are often paired up with each other. Make myself a little smaller here if I can. Come on. Sorry, trying to find a good place to put myself. I keep showing different parts of the screen, need to move myself around. But with the imperfect subjunctive right here, so in that case, it's going to be tuviera, si él tuviera el dinero. And then the conditional, vendría a la fiesta. So these two tenses are oftentimes going to be paired with each other for hypothetical situations, for hypothetical if would statements. So if, so see, if, and then would is going to be vendría. There we go. So if, see, and then would, that would is just part of the conjugation right here. That's what that ia right there signifies, is would. So these hypothetical if-would statements are always going to use this conjugation pattern. So you're always going to have the imperfect subjunctive paired up with the conditional. So let's go ahead and move on, and let's see if we can do another exercise that's going to be basically the same thing. So let me get myself down here, and we'll start with if she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. Okay? So if she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. So how are we going to start this translation? Funny how you're teaching this, and I struggle sometimes with had I in English because the verb tense after is tricky. Had I known. Yeah, and it is tricky in English, using the subjunctive because our conjugations in English, Mabalina, they don't really change. They don't really take on different forms like they do in Spanish. In Spanish, it's obvious when you're using the subjunctive mood because the conjugation is going to lead itself to that. It's obvious from that. Whereas in English, our conjugations are going to be exactly the same. They're never going to really change. There are some very unusual situation or more rare situations, like the word were, where I say if I were, that's going to be a subjunctive usage. And we don't really talk about that in English. We don't talk about the subjunctive much. But if I were, that's always going to be for a hypothetical sort of statement. You're never going to say I were 10 years old when it happened or something like that. You're never going to say that. But if I were, and then whatever comes after is going to be using the conditional. So we still use these same structures in English, but we don't really look at it that way. We don't really look at it as subjunctive and then the conditional because we don't really think about the subjunctive too much in English. It's not something we have to because our conjugations don't really change that much. But let's go ahead and take that down there. Okay. I'm gonna rewrite this real quick just to give myself a little bit more room. Okay, so I think that's still pretty much clear. Ellos, ellas, and ustedes. So the sentence right here, if she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. Does anybody have any ideas on where we're going to start? Let's say what's going to be the first word in this sentence? What's the first word we use in our translation? Okay, exactly. See. So that's going to be see. So that's just if. So that's going to be our first word right there. If she knew the answer, see is our first word. So now we need to give ourselves the conjugation. Now we need to get to the conjugation for she knew. So what verb do we use to say when we talk about knowing facts, knowing certain information? I feel like cheating. You're not because you know the translation. You're just as bilingual as everybody else who's answering. You're just coming from a native Spanish speaker's perspective, but you still understand exactly what I'm asking in English. So I don't look at that as cheating. You're coming at it from another angle. No, no, not cheating at all. But so she knew. What verb are we going to use for this here? For to know equals. So what verb do we use in Spanish to say to know? I know some of you guys know this. To know is somebody must know it. Come on, guys. All right. To know, saber. Okay, so saber is going to be the verb for to know. Alguien debe saberlo. I guess not. Al parecer no. Saber. To know. So if you say I don't know in Spanish, which is no sé, that's I don't know. So no sé is I don't know. So it's saber. Okay? So just like before, we need to get to the imperfect subjunctive. So for saber, we need to get to the third person preterite, third person plural preterite, then drop the ron from the end and add our ending. Okay? So those are the 3 steps that we need to follow in order to get to the imperfect subjunctive. Okay? So let's see. So for saber, oh, and by the way, saber also means to taste. Just so you guys know. So if you want, lo sabía. Just testing the chat. Yeah. Thank you, Mimi. But saber also means to taste. So if you want to say something like this soup tastes like chicken. Esta sopa, which is this soup, esta sopa, sabe, which means taste, sabe a, tastes like pollo. This soup tastes like chicken. Esta sopa sabe a pollo. So it's not saying this chicken or this soup knows chicken. It's just a different usage of that same verb. It means to taste. But in this case, we're going to be talking about to know. And then also mention real quick that there's also to know, which is conocer. So saber is going to be used for like facts, information, skills, stuff like that. Conocer is going to be like when you know like a person, knowing people, when you're to be familiar with. So we also use it when we're talking about like when you travel to a certain place and you get familiar with that place when from traveling from there, you use the verb conocer for that. So it's like to know a person. It's also to meet. Conocer also means to meet. but it's for meeting a person or in general, just kind of like to be familiar with is kind of like a good way of looking at it. So saber is going to be for like facts, information, and skills to mean to know. And then conocer is going to be for like when you meet a person, you know that person, or like to be familiar with is basically what that means. But we're going to use the verb saber here. Okay, let's see. So does anybody know the conjugations in the preterite for saber? Preterite conjugations for saber. Esto sabe a rayo. A rayo? Like a ray? Like a beam? Like lightning or something? It tastes like lightning? Tastes like a ray? Okay. A pretty cool idiom. Okay, so let's see. So for our preterite conjugations for saber, it's going to be yo supe. Okay? So supe is going to be our yo form. Supiste. Supo. Supimos. Nosotros supimos. And the one we're really looking for here is going to be our last one. So yo supe, tú vos supiste, él, ella, usted supo, nosotros supimos, vosotros supisteis, ellos, ellas, ustedes supieron. So there's that ron. That's what we're looking for right there. That's going to be the ending that we're going to drop. So the third person plural preterite, supieron. Okay? And then this ron, we're going to drop that. So it's going to leave us with that right there. So soup. That's what it's going to leave us with right there. Okay. That's our preterite. And then tú supiste a lot when saying a story to someone. Tú supiste que no haré eso. You knew that I won't do that. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Okay. So in this case, we're going to work off of supieron. And that's going to be this word right here, or this root right here. So let me go ahead and get rid of that. Okay, so we're gonna take our root right here, S-U-P-I-E. That's our root, and then we need to add the ending for our conjugation, and that's how we're gonna get the imperfect subjunctive. Oops. So for the imperfect subjunctive, does anybody remember the endings that we add? Imperfect. Imperfect subjunctive. Does anybody remember what endings we're going to add for these different forms? So we've got yo supiera or se. These are both perfectly valid. Ras or ses. El, ella, usted, ra or se. And of course, just like I mentioned before, these conjugations for el, ella, usted, they are going to be the exact same conjugations for yo. That's something that you're going to see a lot with the subjunctive mood, especially both in the past tense with the imperfect and also in the present tense with the present subjunctive is that the conjugations are going to match in those forms. So really, we just need to know the context is what we're talking about. If we don't know the context, we're going to include the subject. So the subject is optional as long as you already know from the context what we're talking about. But ra, ras, ra, and then we've got ramos. And, oh, and then also we have to put the accent right before. So that E, which is right before, is going to be accented. And Samos. And I'll put that accented E as well. Right there. And then rice. Face. And ran. And sen. So because the sentence that we're using here is if she knew the answer. If she knew the answer, she would tell it to us, okay? So we've got supieron is where we started from saber, right? Saber. We're going to start with supieron, take that ron off, and then we're going to add our ending. So that's going to give us either supiera or supiese. So this is going to be, either one is going to be valid here. But like I said, the ra is generally going to be the more common usage that you're going to find. So I would say as long as while we're learning, let's try and stick with that. Either one is totally fine. You want to be able to recognize either one. You want to be able to use either one. But realistically speaking, in most cases, you're going to see the ra form more often being used than that se form. Obviously, there's regional differences and such, but that's what you're going to see more often, at least. So that's going to be si supiera. So that's going to be our next word. So if she knew, si supiera. So now we need the word for the answer. So does anybody know the answer? How do we say the answer? What's the answer? How do we translate the answer? How do we translate this? Roblox showcases iera. Yep, that's exactly right. So it's going to be supiera. Exactly. So how do we translate our next word in the sentence here? The answer. If she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. Man, that green is kind of hard to read on the board, isn't it? Give you guys a second here. I'm going to see if turning the light on makes it any easier to read that. That's a little bit better, I guess. Yeah. Okay. All right. The answer. La. Last chance. Anybody know it? La. No? Nobody? Okay, so la respuesta. Okay. So if she knew the answer, si supiera la respuesta. And if we're not sure from the context that we're talking about she, of course, we can add in ella right there, or we can add it, add it right here if we wanted to. If it's not already clear from the context, it just depends on who you're talking to, what they already do or don't know that you're talking about. I'm not sure would be the correct, because we use so many different tenses. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pin this right up here. Avelina, that is perfect. Nos la diría. Okay, so we We got exactly the right answer here. And I'm going to go into the next part right here. So she would tell it to us, okay? So for that, we're going to use the verb for to tell, which is the same as the verb for to say, which is to tell, say, is decir, okay? So decir is another very, very, very common word in Spanish, and it's irregular. It's irregular in the future. It's irregular in a lot of tenses, in most tenses, but it's irregular in the future and conditional as well. So what makes it irregular in the future and the conditional, and I'm going to go ahead and change the color here on this to red, because we drop these two letters. When we conjugate into the future and into the conditional with decir, we're going to start by dropping those two letters. So that's going to give us dir. D-I-R. So this is going to be the root that we use for future conditional. So this is going to be the root that we use for the future and the conditional. Ella sabía la respuesta. Debió decir. Okay, well, Alejandro, that's not exactly how I would say it. Sabi, like, that's not quite a hypothetical conjugation. Like, I definitely get where you're coming from, but I am going, no, you're doing good. You're doing good. You're doing good. No, no, but I'm going for the whole idea here of this part of the exercise is the imperfect subjunctive and conditional pair. That pairing up that we see commonly, that imperfect subjunctive and conditional. So we've got our imperfect subjunctive right here. Supiera, si supiera ella la respuesta, if she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. So that's a whole lot of words right there. She would tell it to us. That's 6 words in English. In Spanish, we only need 3 words to say this, okay? So we're going to start with the actual verb, which we've got decir, to say. To get it into the future or conditional, we're going to drop these 2 letters right here. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. EC, decir. So it's dir. And then the conditional for ella, we're going to use that IA, right? Same as before. IA. And then we're going to add in our root at the front. Diría. So diría, this word right here, diría, means would tell. Okay? So we got that part covered. Well, she would tell. We've got that part covered. So it to us. So how are we going to say she would tell it to us? So we're going to need to use some pronouns here, right? We're going to need to use 2 pronouns for this. So for us and for it, those are the 2 we're going to use. It and us. So what are the pronouns that we're going to use here? What pronouns are needed to complete the translation? How are we going to translate it and to us? I'm going to give you guys a little hint here. So it is going to be, let me see if I can find a better place for myself on the screen here. That should be good. So it is a direct object. Okay. So in this sentence, it is going to be our direct object. And to us, or just us, to us is going to be our indirect object. So we've got a direct object and an indirect object. Okay, so we've got... Okay, so Mavelina is saying nos lo, and then it would be nos lo hubiese or hubiera dicho. So this is an interesting example right here, and I'm glad that you brought this up. It is very typical to use the imperfect subjunctive twice in a sentence like this as well. If it is something that's really very hypothetical, I've noticed a lot, and this is coming from a non-native speaker's perspective, of course. So please definitely let me know how you feel about it. But if something is really hypothetical, it is common where we'll have the imperfect subjunctive used at the front for if she knew, si supiera. But then this would tell, she would tell, is also going to be in the imperfect subjunctive. So in this case, I'm using the conditional, but depending on the level of hypotheticality, I guess, if that's even a word, the level of the hypotheticality, we might use the imperfect subjunctive on both sides of this sentence. And it's not wrong to say it that way. It's just kind of tricky knowing when you would or wouldn't use it, and it's really more based on well, the vibe, I guess, the vibe of the speaker and the message that they're trying to convey. But in this case, I am using the conditional because I'm really trying to drive home this imperfect subjunctive and conditional usage. So we are using the conditional here. But yeah, it is tricky. I agree. It's tricky. Yeah, see, nos hubiese dicho, nos hubiera dicho. So it's another usage right there where you've got the imperfect subjunctive. So this is the imperfect subjunctive, and then it's being used with haber, and then you've got the past. I'm going to go ahead and pin this comment right here. There we go. So nos hubiera or nos hubiese, either way, dicho. So that's still using the verb decir right here, but it's using the past participle and it's using haber. So this is a usage of the perfect aspect. So with that, with the imperfect subjunctive and then using haber and then dicho followed afterward, that's going to be an example of I believe the name for it is the pluperfect. I'm sorry, and I'm kind of failing on a teacher on that front that I don't remember offhand the name of that tense, but I think it's the pluperfect or what's it called in Spanish? Pluscuamperfecto, something like that. I don't remember exactly the name of it all the time. It's kind of weird, a weird name, but I remember how it's used. Mavelina saying yes. Okay, but yeah. So this is something. Yeah, pluscuamperfecto. Okay, so this is something that is totally common as well, where you have the imperfect subjunctive in this first usage, and then the second part of the sentence is also going to be the imperfect subjunctive. So here I'm using the conditional, but it's absolutely valid to use the imperfect subjunctive afterward. But where we're going to say would tell it to us. So we're using let's get back on track here, the direct object to say it. Now, in this case, it is going to be referring to the answer. She would tell it to us. So you could use it in kind of like a general sense to say like it, like whatever it is in various situations. In this case, I'm referring specifically to the answer, la respuesta. So I'm going to use the la direct object, the la direct object, because that's referring to la respuesta. So that's going to take the form of it right there. But we could also use lo right there. Either would be fine. It's kind of just the context of what we're trying to say. But when we're specifically referring to this part of the sentence right here, when we just named la respuesta, if I want to say it to refer to what I just said, la respuesta, to say it, I'm going to use la because it needs to agree in gender right there. And then we've got nos. Now, we can't do it this way. We can't do la nos diría. And does anybody know why this is wrong right here? Does anybody know why this would be wrong to say? La nos diría. Let me put this in the chat here. Why is it wrong to say la nos diría? La is for the object and the pronoun goes first. That's exactly right. So with these objects here, we have a direct object and we have an indirect object. And there's another type of pronoun that we use, which is our reflexive pronouns as well. Reflexive pronouns. So direct object pronouns, indirect object pronouns, and reflexive pronouns. So every single time that we combine these pronouns in a sentence in Spanish, they always have to follow the same order, whether we're using a reflexive and an indirect, or a reflexive and a direct, or a direct or an indirect. It doesn't matter. We always have to use the correct order, which is going to be the reflexive first. The reflexive pronouns are always going to come first. And then from there, we have our indirect object pronouns. And then third is our direct object pronouns. We always have to put reflexive, then indirect, then direct. That's the order we always use for that. So in this case, la nos diría is totally wrong, okay? Because we're putting the direct object, which is la, we're putting the direct object before the indirect object, before nos. And you cannot do that. Don't ever do that. You have to put the indirect object first and then the direct object. So that's going to be our sentence. That's going to be our completed sentence right there. That's our translation. So if she knew the answer, she would tell it to us. Si supiera or supiese, both are fine here. Si supiera ella la respuesta, nos la diría. Okay? Alrighty. Okay, does anybody have, now we've done 2 exercises here. Does anybody have any sentences that they would like to translate that we can do as an exercise? Or does anybody have any questions? Any questions or any specific sentences you'd like translated? Any specific questions or suggestions for an exercise? What do you want to see translated? Is there something that's been giving you a hard time in your translations that you're not quite figuring out? Let's talk about it. What do we got? If we haven't got any questions or anything that we want translated, I'm going to go ahead and come up with another exercise here. Give a few more seconds, see if anybody's got anything they want to throw in the mix here. Hawaii vibes. Yep. I'm on perpetual vacation. Anytime I'm not at work, I'm just vibing. Ah, me too. Me too. I need a vacation as well. Okay, como dices en inglés? Aquí hay tomate. Okay. All right. Why not? Let's do it. Okay, let me go ahead and transition here. Okay. So, the question is, how do we translate aquí hay tomate? Apparently, this is a phrase in Spain which I haven't heard before. How do you use that phrase? I'm not familiar with that phrase. I mean, we could directly translate it. I'm not really sure how that phrase is used. Gossip. Okay. I'm not really sure what would be like an equivalent phrase to that, because that's where it gets interesting, where you start getting into phrases and trying to translate them between languages. It can get a little bit tricky. Yeah, gossip, chisme. Yeah, gossip is chisme, exactly. Chisme. Um, Trying to translate phrases, because I don't really know of an equivalent phrase in English that we would use for this, but let's go ahead and just do a quick translation, because there is something useful here that we can talk about. So the word aquí. So this is a location verb, or this is a location word right here. So it's how we say here. So, okay, okay, yeah, yeah. I guess you could say, yeah, we got the tea. That's a good one. Let me go ahead. I'm gonna pin that right there. The tea. So here is the word for aquí. And aquí is more specific than acá, which is aquí is more akin to like saying like right here. It's more of a specified location. Acá is more like a broader area, generally speaking. But then really the reason I wanted to translate this is just because that word right there, I, is it indicates the existence of something. It means is, but it's not like ser, which is. There's it's just gonna say that there is, as far as talking about existence. So here there is. So that's gonna be I. And then tomate is just tomato. So this phrase that who was it? Uriel? I think that was Uriel that mentioned that. Okay, yeah. So this phrase that Uriel had mentioned, in if we translate it into English, here there is tomato, or also there's tomato here. That doesn't really make any sense when we try to translate it directly. And that's something that is a great point as far as trying to translate idioms. So, Mabalino had made a great example that I didn't even think about. But as far as there being gossip, here's the tea. Here's the tea. So in English, the term tea for talking about gossip, well, Uriel had mentioned that this phrase they use in Spain, they use the word tomato for that, which I guess I could kind of see a little bit. I don't know where exactly that came from, but tomatoes are red, and you hear gossip and your face gets red. So I can kind of see that a little bit. Spill the beans, say what's up. Yep, exactly. Ah, there's something fishy going on. Okay. Learned idiomatic expressions after I graduated from my English classes, and I'm so glad I did. Yeah, learning idioms is something that really is, especially if you're going to be traveling to a specific region somewhere that uses certain idioms more than other places. It really helps a lot to connect with the native speakers of that language, because you're saying things that you're not translating. You know, you can't really translate an idiom. You either know it or you don't. You know, there's equivalent idioms in different languages sometimes. Like in Spain, in Spanish, when we want to say to speak of the devil, so to speak of the devil, or speaking of the devil, speaking of the devil. So we're talking like when we're talking about somebody else, and then all of a sudden, like they pop up or whatever. Hey, speaking of the devil. Well, in Spanish, the expression for that. Does anybody know that expression, by the way? Before I put it up on the screen, could you please one day translate one flamenco song? Uriel, do you have any suggestions for a flamenco song? I would love to do one for an immersion exercise. I'm sure there's lots of great options out there, but if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear it. I'm taking notes as well, so I follow many showbiz accounts. The word flabbergasted, yeah, yeah, that's a fun word in English. Flabbergasted, definite English word I always remember because it's different. It's very different. So, speaking of the devil, this idiom that we use in English, it has a very close equivalent in Spanish. Yep. Okay. Hablando del rey de Roma. Exactly. Hablando del rey de Roma, which is speaking of the king of Rome. So it's making the exact same point basically. It's very very similar as far as these two expressions between each other, but they're just a little bit different. You know, when you want to say speaking of the devil, you're not going to translate that directly into Spanish. You're not going to talk about El Diablo. You're talking about El Rey de Roma. You're talking about the king of Rome. But the point of the idiom is exactly the same as far as its usage. All right. And then let's see. We got my favorite expression in Spanish, or at least my favorite expression that I've learned so far, is ahogarse en un vaso de. Oops, hold on. There we go. En un vaso de agua. Ahogarse en un vaso de agua. Now, that literally is going to translate as to drown in a glass of water. So, does anybody have an idea as far as what this expression is talking about? To drown in a glass of water. When we drown in a glass of water, what is it? What is it that we're describing? What's going on there? It kind of seems really unnecessary, right? I mean, how do you even drown in a glass of water unless you're basically trying to, right? uh, make everything more complicated to worry about something not worth the worry. Exactly. Thank you. So, to worry about something that's not worth the worry. In English, the expression we use is any English speakers here who have an idea of what expression we use for that? So, to drown in a glass of water, to worry about something unnecessarily, to make a bigger deal of something than it really is. So, any English speakers who know what this phrase would be? It's going to be to make a mountain out of a molehill. To make a mountain out of a molehill. So, this is the exact same expression, right? It's completely different. It's a completely different translation. To drown in a glass of water is the translation. And I'm sorry, I can't translate it into Spanish, this one, because I don't know the word for molehill. So sorry, guys. I don't even really know what a molehill is. I don't know. But ahogarse en un vaso de agua. So if you want to say, like, hey, don't worry, don't make such a big deal out of it, you say, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. But in Spanish, we're going to say, no te ahogues en un vaso de agua. So in this case, of course, this conjugation right here, we do have to add that U right there because it's following that G with an E. And whenever we have a G followed directly by an E in Spanish, it's going to be a soft sound. So without this without this U right here, this word would be pronounced more like auges. But we need to make sure it has that same hard G sound from when it was originally spelled with an A following it. So it's ahogues, no te ahogues en un vaso de agua. So don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Let's see. Thinking of some other expressions as well. Let's see. What's another good one? Trying to think. Oops. To rain cats and dogs. To rain cats and dogs. So does anyone know what this expression means, to rain cats and dogs? To rain cats and dogs is basically just means to rain very hard. Nonstop. It's just when it's just raining like crazy, it's raining very, very, very hard. When it's just pouring, it's pouring water out. We say it's raining cats and dogs. It's raining cats and dogs. So it's a fun expression, thinking about cats and dogs falling from the sky, but just talking about raining a lot, raining very hard. So the expression that we use in Spanish, there we go. Okay, thank you, Uriel. Yep. Llover a cántaros. Llover a cántaros, which is to rain jugs. So raining jugs. So it's like pitchers of water pouring out, basically. So it's making the exact same point, In English, we're talking about cats and dogs falling from the sky, but in Spanish, we're talking about jugs falling from the sky. So, you take your opinion on whichever one is worse to deal with. But cats and dogs, not a very fun thing to imagine. Ah. Let's see. Oh, I got another good one here. You should use this one in your YouTube shorts. I remember that one. Oh, you used this one in one of your YouTube shorts. Yep, I did. Yeah, that one of my shorts that I did recently for the translation challenges. I used this exact expression. Llover a cántaros. Okay, so this next one we're gonna use is between a rock and a hard place. Okay, so that's our English expression. So this expression is going to be basically talking about... Oh, no, I'm sorry, you guys. I need to keep better track of where I've got myself on the screen here. Okay, so this expression right here, between a rock and a hard place, is going to be basically talking about being in an impossible situation. How do you describe that? Being in an impossible situation where there is no good option to avoid danger. I would say that would be a pretty good way of explaining that. So we've got so between a rock and a hard place. And Mabalina, excellent. Well done. Very, very well done. Entre la espada y la pared. So in this case, if we translate that directly into English, that's going to be between the sword or the blade and the wall. So when we talk about being between a rock and a hard place in English, and being in an impossible situation where there's not really any good option, there's no good option to avoid danger. We're talking about in Spanish being between the sword and the wall, entre la espada y la pared. So again, the exact same. Yeah, you just assume. Well, hey, perfect. Yeah, because the whole point of these expressions is the meaning. The meaning behind it. So once I explain the meaning, you're like, oh, that sounds like this expression that I already know. So that's a great one. Let's see. Do we have any other expressions? I'm trying to think of a few more, just because these are really fun ones to learn. While we're learning Spanish, we throw these into our vocabulary. We throw these into our sentences. Whether you're a Spanish speaker learning English or you're an English speaker learning Spanish, either way, these are very valuable to learn because it just helps you to really make a very, very well understood point in a way that just really connects with native speakers very quickly, very easily. So, between a rock and a hard place, entre la espada y la pared. Okay, let's see. Plain and simple. Hmm. Plain and simple. Okay, claro y pelado. That's interesting. I haven't heard that one before. But it's like pelar, which is to peel, so it's like clear and peeled. So it's almost like it's almost like it's stripped down from all the dressings on it. It's just very, very clearly presented. In Spain, they say punto y pelota. Okay. A point and ball. Interesting. Okay. All right, cool. See, learning new expressions here. Fun stuff. Punto y pelota. Okay. No way out. Plain and simple. Claro y pelado. Plain and simple. Claro y pelado. Okay. Let's see. Okay, do we want to try doing another translation exercise? We've got a few different expressions down here. But again, trying to translate expressions is really it's really difficult. You can't really translate an expression. You just have to find the equivalent expression that conveys the same meaning. It's not something that you can really do word for word. I can't really think of very many expressions at all between English and Spanish that are using the same words as like a direct translation. Like this one right here, pelado is pelar, which is like to peel. Um, so I'm not really sure. I don't know that I know a single expression between English and Spanish that is the exact same words, just a translation. Does anybody in the chat know? Do you know any expressions which translate perfectly word for word between it is what it is, es lo que hay? That's really close. I is not like saying it is. I is more like saying there is. It is what there is. Um I can't really think of it. Yeah, I agree. It's hard. I can't really think of any at all. Let's see. Okay, I'm thinking for right now, we can go ahead and move on from the expressions. I'll try to. I think for my next live stream, I'll try to come prepared with some expressions that are more closely related to each other and just kind of go through those a little bit. I think that would be fun. But I think for right now, let's go ahead and do another translation exercise. So I've got one in mind here, which is going to be specifically using the subjunctive. So let me see here. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, me. Oh, okay. As me gata Maggie. Is she in the room? Is Maggie in here? I didn't see her. I don't know. I haven't seen her. No, she's good. She's good. She is very cute. She's lovely. I love that cat. She's adorable. Um, but yeah, let's do okay, so let's do another translation exercise. So let's say how about okay, once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to the museum. Okay? Once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to museum. Thank you, Uriel. Yep. I love cats too, Mavalina. They're yeah. I got a cat and a dog, and my cat is just she's just adorable. She's the cutest little thing. I love her so much. She's so sweet. Very, very sweet cat. But okay, so we've got once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to the museum. Now, how are we going to translate this? And I'm gonna give you a hint here. This translation will require the subjunctive. Let me go ahead and okay. Okay, so we've got once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to the museum. Um, Alina, perfect, 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 perfect. Okay, so let's talk about how we get there. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin Amelina's correct answer up top. So we've got first off once. Let's start with this once. So once is talking about the condition being met, right? So we're waiting for the grandkids to arrive, and once they arrive, then we'll all go to the museum, right? So once is going to be the most direct translation that we have for once that you can use is going to be una vez, right? So una vez literally is going to translate to one time, right? One time. But it's how we say once in Spanish. Una vez is once. It's how we say once in Spanish. So that's the word that I'm going to use here because it's the most direct translation to what I included in the English. So una vez que. And I'm putting that que in there because we're introducing a verb afterwards. We're going to be introducing this verb right here. So that means we are going to need to use that que right there in order to introduce that. But as far as once in this usage, what we're talking about is like once this condition is met, or like as soon as it's met, or when it's met. It's all making the exact same point. So the other examples that we've got here that Mabalina had provided are cuando and apenas. So cuando is probably the most common usage that we're going to use for this, and cuando literally is just going to translate to when. So cuando is when, but it serves the same purpose here, right? You know, whether we're saying una vez or cuando, we're saying the same thing. It's once this condition is met, once the grandkids arrive. And then we've also got apenas, which apenas is going to translate to it's kind of like barely. That's one way that we use it in English, or like just when something just happened. So barely or just or like hardly, you know, when, like as far as time expressions, it's gonna be like as soon as something happens, or like after something just happened. Basically, is where we're gonna use that. Once you disrespect me, I'll leave for good. Una vez que me irrespetes, me iré para siempre. Yep, exactly. Yep. Una vez que is once, and then that que is going to be introducing a verb afterward. So the first part of the sentence, I'm using una vez, and when you use it with that, you do need to follow it up with that verb with que. With cuando is not going to be required. Apenas is not going to be required. Um, um, no, actually, I think it is required with apenas. I'm sorry, but with cuando, it's you don't require that que. But una vez que, when you're introducing that verb afterward, it's kind of squeezed on there right there. But una vez que, and then the verb. So the next part we're going to use. The next part we'll need to fill in. We've got once, right? We've got once, una vez que. So the next part that we're going to use is going to be the grandkids arrive. Okay. Now, this being Spanish, the most common way that we're going to translate these sentences is with the subject, as in who's performing the action, in this case, grandkids, is going to come after the verb that we use. That's going to be the more common way that it's going to be used. But you could put it the other way around, but it's not as common that way. So the word for grandkids in Spanish, and we've already got it up on the screen with the pinned comment for grandkids or grandchildren is los nietos. You know, so nieto is the word for grandkid or grandchild. So una vez que, and then we need to use the word for to arrive. So to arrive, I think we all know what this one is. Hold on, sorry. Let me make myself a little bit smaller here. Give ourselves a little more room on the screen. So to arrive is going to be the verb llegar. Okay? So to arrive, once the grandkids, los nietos, arrive, and we're using the verb llegar. So the conjugation that we're going to use here, yep, exactly. Ellos, yep, it's the los nietos is going to be standing in for ellos, or vice versa. Ellos stands in for los nietos. I'm going to include that because we're specifically naming them in the sentence here once the grandkids arrive. So let's put los nietos, and then we're going to put our verb in between right here. We're going to put our verb after una vez que, and then before the subject. So right here in this space is where we're going to use our conjugation of llegar. Okay. So what we need to do in this scenario, because this is a condition that needs to be met. Once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to the museum. That's the sentence, right? Once the grandkids arrive, once this condition is met, then this is going to happen. So because this is a condition that needs to be met, that means that there is an element of uncertainty here, right? Because we don't know when the grandkids are going to arrive. We don't know if the grandkids are going to arrive. We don't know what's going to happen or when it's going to happen necessarily. We don't have any control over that. This is a condition that needs to be met before what we do have control over, which is going to the museum, before that can happen. So once the grandkids arrive, so in this case, we have an element of uncertainty here. So we need to use, what do we need to use? What do we need to use when we're dealing with uncertain situations in Spanish? Let's see. What does the chat have to say? And Mabelina has already given us exactly the conjugation. So what is this an example of? This conjugation in the pinned comment. What is this an example of? We know the verb is llegar, which is an AR verb. But in the conjugation here, it's switched. It's now using an E. So why is it using an E at the end instead of that A like in the infinitive? It's a condition. It's a condition that needs to be met. So it calls for the subjunctive mood. So the subjunctive. So we need to take llegar and put it into the subjunctive. Okay? So for the subjunctive here, basically all we're going to need to do, because llegar is regular, is we're going to take our simple present yo form, which is llego. I don't know why I'm still in caps lock, sorry. Llego. So yo llego. That off bold. So yo llego, that's going to be the indicative present. Try to find a good spot for myself. I'll just put it right here. Yeah. Okay. So yo llego is the indicative present. And then once we take the indicative present, we need to drop the O from the end. So that's going to give us this right here. This is the leg that we're going to work off of. LLEG. So it's just the same word from up here. It's the same word without that O at the end. And now what we're going to do is we're going to replace with opposite ending conjugation. So what do I mean by that? We're going to replace it with the opposite ending conjugation. Well, with this being an AR verb, llegar is an AR verb, llegar. We need to replace that with an E at the end, okay? Now, because we're talking about the grandkids, and just like in the pinned comment, it's ellos, the grandkids is going to be like that, right? So we put EN. But the problem that we now have, because this G right here is a hard G. The verb is llegar. It's got a G followed by an A, and that's always going to be a hard sound, llegar. So now we've got this word right here with that G followed by an E. And what sound does a G make when it's followed by an E in Spanish? It's going to make the same exact sound as a J makes, which is that H sound. So this spelling right here is going to lead the verb to be pronounced as llegen, llegen. So it's going to have that H kind of sound to it. And that's not right, because we know that it's a hard G sound, and that's always going to be preserved. So what do? We add an E, a U. So llegen, hasta llegen. Okay, that's the word right there. So, una vez que lleguen los nietos. So that's what we've got so far. Una vez que lleguen los nietos. Okay? So, let me go ahead and move this down. So we've got the first half of our sentence done. So what are we going to go ahead and do next? We'll all go to the museum. So first off, what's the word for museum in Spanish? Let's get that easy part out of the way. What's the word for museum? Oops. I think I just accidentally deleted a comment instead of unpinning it. Oopsie doopsie. Sorry, Mabalina. Okay. Museo. Exactly. El museo. Okay, so una vez que lleguen los nietos, and then we know the end of the sentence, el museo. Okay? But we've got two right in front of it here, right? Now, Mamalina, you're coming in clutch. You're no, you're great. You're great. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm glad you know the answers because that helps everybody learn who doesn't know the answers. So please, if you know it, keep it coming. But we've got El Museo. So before that, we've got this tu right here. And like we talked about a little bit earlier, tu is going to be a. But the problem that we now have, el is not correct. Whenever we have a and then the article el, we have to change that by dropping that e and merging the two words. So to the museum, which is el museo, it becomes al museo. So al museo. So now we have the last three words. So all we need now is we'll all go. That's all we need. That's all we're missing now. So to say we'll all go, we're going to use the super, super common and very, very irregular verb ir, right? Ir, which is to go. Okay? So the thing about ir is it is irregular in just about every single conjugation. In just about every single tense, ir is irregular. But in the tense that we're using it for here, it's not because we're using the future tense. So we're going to put a future tense conjugation here, okay? And what we're going to do is we need to use the word for we, which we all know is nosotros. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in for now, nosotros. We're going to use that as the word for we. Oh, whoops. Okay, so that's our word for we. So we've got that covered. And then we will all go to the museum. So all, when we're talking about nosotros, is going to be todos. So we can replace todos for nosotros. We can get rid of nosotros because todos means we all, or it will mean we all in a second when we put our conjugation. Then it'll all be clear. But if we just put todos nosotros, yeah, we could do that, but we're not going to need to. So let's get rid of nosotros. Let's say goodbye to that, but we'll put todos. Okay, so we'll all, and now we just need the future tense nosotros conjugation for ir. Now, it is irregular in just about every tense except for the future tense and the conditional tense. The future and conditional conjugations are always going to match each other, just using different endings, but they arrive to the ending using the same method. And in this case, we're using the future tense nosotros form, which is going to give us iremos. Iremos. So, the final sentence that we've got, una vez que lleguen los nietos, todos iremos al museo. So that is our finished sentence. So again, we've got once, which is going to be una vez, once, and then the grandkids is going to be represented here, los nietos. once they arrive. So we're going to put que to introduce our verb. That's the conjunction that's going to introduce our verb. Then the subjunctive usage of llegar. So que lleguen. So once the grandkids arrive, una vez que lleguen los nietos, and then we'll all go to the museum. So todos, as in we all, todos. Iremos means we will all go, and then to the museum. So al museo. Once the grandkids arrive, we'll all go to the museum. Una vez que lleguen los nietos, todos iremos al museo. Okay. We also say desde que lleguen. Well, desde que would be... Oh, okay. Desde que with the subjunctive. That's interesting. So desde que with the indicative. So desde que llegaron with the indicative, in this case the preterite here, would mean since they arrived. So desde means since, and then que is introducing our verb, and then llegaron means they arrived. But what Mabelina's saying here is desde que lleguen. So it's almost like since, like after the point of the oops. There we go. Sorry. So in this case here, what she's saying is desde que lleguen is once they arrive. Or it's almost like saying since the point. I don't even know how you would translate that into English. From the point, you could say from the point they arrive. From the point, or from when they arrive. So that's an interesting usage as well. Desde que. So desde que means like since a certain action happening. But in this case, using it with the subjunctive is going to move it from like a past tense usage with llegaron into the future tense, technically this is the present tense, but the present tense subjunctive is used for future tense actions taking place. So desde que lleguen is once they arrive, or from the point that they arrive is basically the point that we're going to say it. And she's saying, okay, that's a more informal usage. Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, oh my goodness, time has been flying today. Been at this for about 2 hours now. So I think I'm going to try to get to a point to wrap up here. Does anybody have any questions before we go ahead and wrap up, or any last minute things we want to do? Anything as far as struggles with learning English or learning Spanish that maybe I can help with before we wrap up? Let me go ahead and change that there. Thank you for the space, and thank you for teaching others my native language. Well, Mabelina, it was my pleasure, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you for all of your comments. I'm looking forward to doing another live stream. I want to try to do this regularly, like once a month in between producing videos and stuff. I'm really glad that you joined today. It was very, very nice having you. It was very nice having all of you here today. And I'm going to plan on doing another live stream about a month from now. So keep an eye out for that. I think we're going to stick with the last Saturday of the month. It seems like that's just a good schedule to get onto. So let me check my calendar here and see what that would be. That's going to be September the 27th. So that's probably when we'll be doing our next live stream. I'll get that set up for some time soon. But yeah, it was really great having all of you guys here today. This was a pleasure. And yeah, if you guys ever have any questions about learning a new language, about learning Spanish, definitely just hit me up. I'm always just a single comment away, and I'm here for you. So I appreciate you guys. Everybody have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one. All right.